Hey, this is John Ridley.
And this is Matt Carey, Senior Documentary Editor at Deadline.com.
And Matt, I hope you're doing relatively well in this crazy world.
Very well, thank you. And I've been in journalism for several decades now.
Yeah.
And we're going to look at photojournalists, journalists in this episode who do work that's puts their lives at enormous risk. And I just want to parenthetically mention that I have always been really, by and large, in the safety of a newsroom and not in the field in dangerous conditions like that. I did work for CNN for many years and admired greatly those of my colleagues who were willing to go into these dangerous places, but it comes at an enormous cost. It's vital for the public to understand what happens in war zones, but as we see every year, and especially in recent years, a tremendous number of journalists who lost their lives. It's very, very dangerous work.
Yeah, it's really shocking to find out that journalism is becoming one of the most dangerous professions around the world. As you say, Matt, a lot of people just assume folks like yourself, oh, you're just working the phones and this and that. No, you are going out, and there are other individuals who are going to the most hazardous places in the world to show us images and tell us stories that the rest of us, oftentimes, myself included, and I put myself at the top of the list, take for granted. But these two films are incredibly powerful, work from two different perspectives, but ultimately show the humanity and personify the nature of people who are, in some ways, I don't want to say unafraid, but willing to put their fear aside in order to get the story. The first film we're going to talk about is a new film from Nat Geo. It's called Love+War. And the subject of that film is conflict photographer Lynsey Addario. And it's a film that's co-directed by Chai Vasarhelyi and Jimmy Chin. It's going to be in the theaters on October 24th of this year, and it's going to start streaming on Disney Plus starting on November 7th.
Daddy, where's my phone?
Mummy is working, Alfred.
God. Is she downstairs?
She's in another country. But she's gonna come back soon.
This is Lynsey Addario. We're being shelled.
Cheers.
Cheers.
I was just blown away with what Lynsey and what individuals like her are willing to do, not just in telling a story, but balancing the work-life dynamic that most of us have trouble balancing in a regular workday. The other film that we're talking about and the creatives that we're talking with, different than our first film where Lynsey is able to tell her own story. The second film is called Armed Only with a Camera, and it is a film directed by Craig Renaud and produced by Juan Arredondo. But it's about Brent Renaud, the director's brother, who was the first journalist to lose his or her or their life, first American journalist, I should say, to lose his or her or their life covering the war and the Ukraine. And as you can imagine, it's an incredibly personal story told by Craig and Juan about Craig's brother and Juan's friend, and Juan himself, who was there and was wounded in the same ambush by Russian soldiers that took Brent's life.
We're joined by the Renaud brothers, Arkansas filmmakers.
Brent, let's go. Okay. Oh, let's get out of here.
When Brent told me that he wanted to be a documentary filmmaker, I followed my older brother to the most dangerous places in the world.
They're locking in on us.
We've just got some breaking news. Brent Renaud, an American photojournalist, has been killed.
Brent lost his life documenting the horrors of the battlefield in Ukraine.
These are two really powerful, really emotional documentaries. But I think in some of and considering the episodes we've done, Matt, I would say this is probably one of the most powerful episodes that you and I have ever been a part of.
We're very privileged to be joined by the makers of the films and by Craig Renaud, by Juan Arredondo, by Lynsey Addario in the case of Love+War, and Chai Vasarhelyi, Oscar winner for Free Solo. Very powerful.
Very powerful. Here's our conversation with Lynsey Addario and Chai Vasarhelyi. I'm joined this morning by the director of the new documentary Love and War, and the subject, Chai Vasarhelyi and Lynsey Addario. Welcome to you both. I had the opportunity actually to watch the documentary last night. I was tired. I was afraid I wasn't going to get through it all. But I got to tell you, from the opening moments to the final frames, it's really, really galvanizing. And Lynsey, I'm going to say something. I'm probably going to embarrass myself, but if I could do my career over again, there's a part of me, a romantic part of me. If I could be a conflict photographer, there are images that we see every day from distressing parts of the world that I think we take for granted how those images are captured. And there's a part of me who loves photography. I wish I could go out and do that and show people stories. But the reality of your life, your story, and Chai, the way that you captured it, I don't want to say it turned me off to it, but it made me realize that there is something very special about it. So before we get into the film, I've used the word conflict photographer, and I think some people may go, okay, is it someone who gets into arguments when they're shooting? Is it someone who just is in the front lines here domestically? Explain a little bit, if you can, what a conflict photographer is. And Chai, if you can talk about just how you came to Lynsey and her story, because your story, Lynsey, from all regards, is quite remarkable.
Thank you. I guess I'll just start with like a brief description of what a conflict photographer does. I think people have this romantic view of war photographers and war correspondents. And in fact, every time it's depicted in Hollywood, it's often the same. It's sort of this life on the road, maybe a little scarf around the photographer's neck, picking up women left and right. It's usually a man portrayed in that role. Life is fast and exciting and fun, and then a lot of drinking and partying. And usually no one has a personal life because it's often very difficult to have a personal life. And then, either they die at the end or there's some, romance or something that happens. And, it's always very similar. And so I think for me, it's important to talk about what a war photographer is, right? Someone like me, for the last 25 years, as world events happen on a global stage, I often, with very little notice, sometimes 10 minutes notice, will get a call and say, get on the next plane and go to this place. It's often a place people are running from.
Yeah.
I have to do my research kind of on the plane if I am not already familiar with the situation, line up a fixer or a local journalist who agrees to work with me, obviously very dangerous, stressful situations, and basically work 18, 19 hours a day trying to capture a story as soon as I hit the ground and send it back to whatever newspaper I'm working with. Usually it's the New York Times, for the readers to read by the next morning. So, a lot of these things that happen in war zones, we're not showing up to a 5-star hotel. We're showing up often to sleeping wherever we can, sometimes in a car, looking for internet, trying to file, trying to find food. It's very, very stressful and difficult. So the glamour is not really there, sadly.
Yeah, the glamour is not there. And what you talk about is maybe 1/3 of the entire documentary, in the sense that this is also very much a story about you as a person, and particularly you as a mother. I would also say it's very much a documentary about women in the workplace. So if we can, and real quick, I want to come back to that because, Chai, I do want to get to you and just how you found Lynsey. And there's a level where that's a bad question for me because, Lynsey, I have not mentioned, you're a Pulitzer Prize winner. You do work for the New York Times. You are out there getting stories. And unfortunately, I didn't know your story, which to a degree is okay. That's why there's a doc, and that's why we're learning. Chai, you obviously knew this story. And at some point, everything that Lynsey's talking about, and I know that you've done many docs and gone out, and by the way, I should mention, Academy Award winner, free solo, congratulations. But you're also out capturing a story. Was that part of what attracted you to Lynsey's story?
I've been a long time fan of both Lynsey's work. I mean, the images are iconic. They are some of the most important images that have shaped, kind of how my generation looks at, conflict around the world. but also a fan of Lynsey and her sheer kind of heart and force of character and dogged pursuit of the good fight. And I think a lot of people have asked Lynsey if they could tell their story, and I tell her story. And I was really happy and honored that Lynsey agreed to allow us to try. And, there's something, I think, especially now where the institution of journalism is under attack from every side. Truth is being degraded on a daily basis. And if I think one of the things that just makes me really emotional about the film is like you actually see the work, like the real work and the craft and the art that goes into every photograph, and that there's a human who is putting their body in that position and because they believe in the truth of the situation and thinks it's important to be able to capture it. For me, sitting. And if anything, when you watch the film, I think you can come away with just this reminder of just how important the work is, and also what an extraordinary person it takes, and that Lynsey is, and how much she balances, and that it's not easy, but it is kind of the good fight.
Yeah, you talk about the balance and not being easy, and Lynsey, and I don't want to talk about you, Lynsey, as though you're not here, but Chai, you just mentioned, the heart and the dogged nature, and we see the heart early on. The film begins where, Lynsey, you're covering the conflict in the Ukraine. Some of it, I don't want to say is funny, but there's a moment where bombs are falling and there's an older woman who keeps walking, and she says, why are you afraid? This is how we live every day. There is truth to that in the sense that that's part of what you're doing, is showing us, the rest of us who are nowhere near the Ukraine, that there are folks who deal with this. So very early on, we see what you're dealing with. We see how you interact with your subjects. But then in the span of, and correct me if I'm sort of over embellishing, but a few hours, you're leaving the war zone, getting on a plane, traveling a few time zones, getting home, so that on schedule, as a partner and a member of a family, you can go see one of your kids' recitals, just like the rest of us who are just trying to get through traffic on the 405 and get home. And that's this mind-blowing moment of, you talk about, Chai, the balance, but balancing war and, to the title of the film, Balancing Love and War. Talk a little bit, Lynsey, if you care to, about your family dynamic, and that balance that you got to achieve as much as you can. Yeah.
The thing is, it's all relative, right? Anyone who is a parent and also has a job or a profession has this impossible struggle where we're trying to balance being a good parent and being good at what we do. And so, of course, everyone says, yeah, but you go to war. Of course, yes, I go to war, but that is my job and that is my calling, and that is sort of weirdly, my comfort zone, right? So it's, for me, I don't look at it like that. I look at it as, I'm out there. Yes, I'm under mortar attack. I'm trying to make images. I'm trying to file those images. I'm trying to stay alive. But then at the end of the day, I have to go home to my kids, and my kids have no idea where I've just come from. And they don't care where I've just come from. They just want me in the auditorium at their school when all the other parents are there. So, it's all relative at the end of the day. And I think, the way the film opens, I love it because it does sort of condense my life into a very quick sort of opening scene. It's not all in the same day. It's sort of things that happen in quick succession in the first kind of 6 weeks in the war in Ukraine. And then I'm rushing home. And sort of one of the things that I love about it is that it captures something that is exactly what you're speaking to. I leave the airport, I get in a taxi, and the taxi drivers in London, they'll, where are you just coming from? Someplace beautiful. Was the sun shining? And I'm often like, I've just come from, I'm like, yeah, I came from Ukraine. And I don't, and I sort of look at them, look in the rearview mirror and kind of look at me, and I'm 5 feet tall. Like, I'm very small, and I often wear makeup because I'm always dressed like a man. I'm always wearing cargo pants and big boots and no makeup and hair thrown up. And so I really try when I'm not in a war zone to be like really girly. And it's so funny watching that come together in the rearview mirror, and Chai gets like on several occasions it's there, and it makes me laugh because it's something that I'm always laughing at. Like, I wish someone could capture these conversations because it's hilarious looking at the feedback.
You say you go to work like anybody else. And of course, yes and no. You're being shot at, you're being bombed. And we see that in the film. But there's also, and as I mentioned, to me anyway, as a dude, I'm watching the film and I am absorbing so much about women in the workplace, right? And there's a moment in the film, obviously because of your stature and what you do, you're on, I don't want to say panels, but you do many interviews, you're on stage, you're giving talkbacks and things like that. And there's a moment where a gentleman,
Chris Dickey.
Okay. Good. All I can say is, as a caveman man, it could have been me, but thank God it wasn't. But he asked a question that in some ways for a lot of dudes, and I'm going to say it is fundamental. Hey, why are you going out there because you're a mom? Why are you going out there because you have a kids? Or I believe he asked, are you going to continue to go out? You've just had, I believe, your first child.
Mhm.
You're honestly, I think in the story, 3 months, 9 months, 10 months away.
I think it was
beyond.
3 months. I had just, I can't remember how long after.
It's mentioned in the film, but it's less than a year.
I think it's 10 weeks.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So we're talking, you truly just had a child. And this gentleman asked if you're going to continue to go out and do what you do. And I don't believe you say F you, but I think that the undertone, and it's not mean or harsh, but it's like, why would you ask this question of a woman? Do you ask this question of a man? And that takes us, Chai, into quite a section of the film where it really is about reminding people that whatever job you see, women have been doing it since day one. And particularly in conflict photography. And I would love to give you a moment just to give a shout out to the folks who've come before you, the folks who are doing it now, and why it's so important to bust this myth that it's guys who are the only ones going out and doing this.
Yeah, I mean, I would not be here if it weren't for all the women who came before me, right? I mean, I just saw Lee Miller exhibit this morning. There's Gerda Taro who who was with Robert Capa, but no one knows who she is because all the attention, of course, went to Capa. There are Susan Meiselas. There are all of these women. There are tons of women, and not only war photographers. There are just photographers like Mary Ellen Mark, Nan Golden, Sally Mann, people who have shaped kind of boundaries or the way I don't have to have boundaries when I tell stories, that I'm just trying to capture the human essence. That is so important to me, whether I'm in war or I'm at home. And so I think, it's very important to pay tribute to all the people who came before me and the people who are working now, because it is still difficult. I remember when I started covering war 25 years ago, and I thought, okay, there aren't that many women around. Paula Bronstein was with me and she's still out there working. And I thought, okay, in 20 years, there will be half men, half women. And that just has not happened. I mean, it's not, the ratio has not changed that much.
Yeah, there's a moment in the film where you're recounting a story that a gentleman tells you, well, he's a gentleman lightly, but I believe he's a New York Times editor. And very early on, he's, almost stereotypically out of a film with no shame saying that women are never going to be New York Times quality workers.
I mean, the irony, of course, of that was that at that moment, I had already won a Pulitzer for the New York Times, and I had been working for the New York Times for 15 years. And so here was an editor who was, I don't know how many years into his tenure there, and he was telling me there were no women good enough for the New York Times. And I think, look, the fact is that editors want to sort of make a photographer when they bring them in. And so I was someone that already had a profession, right? So it wasn't possible for him to sort of make my career. But, before that sentence, I had asked to go to Mosul, and he looked at me and said, I'm not sending you to war. You're a mother now. So there's a lot to unpack. It's not just, there are no women good enough to work for the New York Times. It's also,
Right.
you're now a mother and I will no longer send you to war. And for anyone who has a calling in their life to be punished and to have that calling sort of taken away and questioned and sort of put at at a distance that's unobtainable just because I've become a mother was really heartbreaking.
One of the things that's very interesting to me about this film, and Kai, this question's directed to you, based on what the work that I've seen of yours, Chai, I'm not surprised that you were able to capture the conflict and the more distressing parts. But this film is also incredibly sensitive. And it really is about a relationship. And it goes to some places, they're very personal. Lynsey, about your relationship with your husband, about how your kids react to, as they get older, to where you're going, about your family, about your mom and dad, about physical difficulties that you've had and how they've impacted childbirth for you and things like that. So there are places in this film that are as intimate as they can be. Chai, I'm interested in your approach and the trust building that you did, whether Lynsey, there were no-go zones for you, but making a film that really is, in my opinion, a complete and total picture of a subject, and one certainly beyond, the hardcore go-go aspects of the story.
Lynsey does what I do, right? Lynsey has spent a career documenting some of the most difficult moments in people's lives. And, she knew exactly what the task was, and I think she made a decision very early on that it had to be authentic and it has to be real. And if she was going to participate in making a film, she would, like, everything was game, and that was a very brave decision for her and for Paul and her family to make, because it's just, you don't do it. You can't be half-assed about it. It's like you have to it's like open-hearted and you have to do it. So that was actually kind of an easier part of making this film because Lynsey knows, and a lot of people who aren't nonfiction, like photographers or nonfiction filmmakers, don't really understand that. So, it's actually funny. You just reminded me of the one thing that was the no-go, which was, remember, Lynsey, when you got the pre-novo scan? Okay, and so she was like, if I am going to get this full body scan, and it turns out I'm like terminally ill, I don't think I feel comfortable with you filming as I figure out that I'm terminally ill. And of course, we ended up filming anyway.
Okay,
and I would have let you use it. I mean, I don't know what I was thinking because obviously that's an important moment. I mean, I don't know why I thought you would not.
It's existential. But it was like an existential moment. And I was like, I get it. Like, I don't know if I would want anyone to film if I was going to find out I'm dying.
But which is so crazy because when you're in a war zone, like when I'm working with Andrei Dubček and I say like, okay, if we get hit by a mortar and I die, you're allowed to film me. Like we have these conversations. So
Wow.
I don't know why the pre-nouveau scan would be any different,
And I'm curious, Chai, in the back of your mind, like, yeah, we're not going to film. Have the camera ready. Just be ready.
Oh, no, 100%. I knew we would film. And of course, if she was getting terrible news, we would probably use it. It would probably be the open of the film, and then it changes the whole deal. Okay. And I'd probably have to have some awkward conversation about how, like, it's really important that we got this, but it was just it just gets to the absurdity of all of it, which I think is true of the work itself, is like, these are the most, intimate moments, like Lynsey captures on camera, like the most intimate moments and a lot of like the worst moments of someone's life. And you see that in the film with the picture, with the photograph she took of Irpin Bridge, but like there is an importance to it. And that's kind of a covenant that we make. It's a decision someone makes and you have to trust the photographer. And so I think it was a real pleasure to be able to work with someone who understood, like in her bones, the importance of an image and access.
You talk about the women of the jihad and the women in Afghanistan who are so abused and have so little hope that their form of trying to end their lives is typically, not exclusively, typically pouring gas or oil or some kind of accelerant on them, burning themselves. Oftentimes, they do not kill themselves, and there are wards and hospitals dedicated to women who burn themselves. And the pictures, there's a moment where you talk in the documentary, and I understand what you're saying, you smell the women before they arrive, right? So that's as graphic. I know you're not trying to be graphic, but expressive, I think, is a better word. That alone is really, really powerful. And there's a whole narrative where you're in Afghanistan before the war. You say nobody even wanted the pictures, couldn't give them away. War begins after 9/11. You're there. Everybody wants you there, suddenly telling a story. 20-year war, people forget. And then once the fall and the Taliban come back, all of a sudden people want you back. And there's a sense, what did I do? What did I do? What did I change? That's its own story. There's another story that I was thinking of, and forgive me jumping around, but I will just say to the audience, that's how packed this documentary it is. It's the most packed 93 minutes that I think you're going to see. Okay. There's another story where you talk about sort of and I'm going to put it in quotes, the victories and where your photography truly makes a difference. I believe you're in the Sudan. Correct me if I'm wrong. But Sierra Leone, photographing women going through childbirth, which is obviously difficult under the best circumstances, but should be a moment of just joy for everyone involved. And the mortality, the death rate at birth is astronomical. I don't even want to guess the numbers. If you remember them, you may say them, but
1 in 8 women. Yeah. At that point, there were 500,000 women a year dying in childbirth in 2010.
Your photographs made a real, true, substantive difference in the lives of these women. Talk about for a second the reaction from these photographs.
So, often I do these stories and I send them out into the world and I don't look back. I never really know if they have an impact. I hope they have an impact. And that is what inspires me to keep moving forward. And in this case, I did a story of Mama Cisse. She was a young woman, pregnant with twins, gave birth in the village, took an ambulance to the nearest hospital, which was a canoe ride and a 6-hour ambulance ride away. Got to the hospital. Of course, there was one doctor in the entire province, which is one of the reasons so many women were dying in childbirth in Sierra Leone in 2010. Got there. She was exhausted. We talked for about an hour while she sort of rehydrated and regained her energy. And she was scared and exhausted. And she finally delivered the second baby and started hemorrhaging. And in the middle of this, for some weird reason, I thought I could shoot video at that time. And I have one of those weird JVC, and so I'm like trying to shoot video and I'm trying to shoot stills. And then I realized she's bleeding profusely. And I really hadn't photographed that many bursts. And so I said, I think she's bleeding too much. And all the midwives were kind of just mopping up the blood and saying, no, she's fine. And then I panicked and I actually ran to find the one doctor in the whole province, and he was in surgery. And I actually put on scrubs, went into surgery, was like, I think there's a woman dying. He looked at me like I was crazy. I went back. They brought Mama Cisse out. She died. And that story was published in across 8 pages in Time magazine. And very luckily, it coincided with a huge women's conference in Washington, D.C. And Time magazine decided to send 3,000 copies of that magazine to the conference. And someone at Merck, the pharmaceutical company, picked it up. And he decided to lay it out for all the board members attending a meeting subsequent to that, where they would discuss corporate responsibility. And it wasn't only because of my essay, but I think it contributed to the fact that at that point, so many women were dying in childbirth. It was a cause that you can impact and can decrease the numbers. He showed the photo essay to all the board members. And at the end, they decided unanimously to spend $500 million and put it aside for Merck for Mothers and to start Merck for Mothers.
What I find so moving about Lynsey's work is exactly the gaze that she brings. It's this idea of, is it because she's a woman? I don't know. But it's the idea that she does look at the lives of those who are most affected by conflict and who are the most vulnerable, which are often women and children. And the idea that there's so many levels, from that New York Times editor who was like, I'm not sending a mother out there, like it's not just that she's a woman. It's like that we desperately need to have access to what she finds interesting and what she finds important. And so, I think that's the point right now, is that we're like, how we receive news is being controlled. The resources behind getting us information. Like, I mean, there are no international journalists allowed in Gaza. Like, this is a real problem, and this is affecting our ability to understand our world, to how we make decisions, how, I don't know, everything. It's like a controlling of information. And I think that, that's why this film is important now.
I think it's fascinating because we're still having this conversation about, women on the front line, and can women be on the front line, and are they strong enough? And, I'm constantly battling sort of these unconscious biases with, like, will they send me on this assignment because I know that maybe my editor is thinking, well, if she gets killed, she's a mother and then her kids will have no child, or is she strong enough physically to keep up, or whatever. But the irony is that I myself go into the field, and I remember when the war in Ukraine started, and I had no idea how tough Ukrainian women are. I just had no idea. I hadn't really worked there. And I remember one of the first times we were in Donbass and we got sent to this sort of like very frontline position, and we had to stop and pick up the press officer. And it was this woman, Irina, who I was like, oh no, it's a woman. She's not going to take us close. And boy, was I wrong. I mean, she was like walking through fire. It was like and I was like cowering in a ditch, I mean, it's so funny because I'm a woman and I also do the same thing, and it's just years of society sort of telling us. And it's like, even now that the nature of war is changing, we're not like, it's not D-Day anymore, it's drones. So it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. It's like, it's a much more technological war, but still we're having the same dumb, outdated conversation.
By the way, there's an entire thread of this story about a young lady, I believe she was a school teacher in the Ukraine, who becomes a soldier and is willing to go out. And I've seen other documentaries, I believe in Porcelain War, where you see women who are fighting. So look, I'm not advocating just for anybody to go to war. I wish we didn't have wars. There's one other thing I want to hint at, and I don't necessarily want to talk about it because I think people should experience in the documentary, but you're not shy about talking about an incident where you and fellow journalists were kidnapped in Libya and going through it. And to me, at that point, you're treated largely just the same as your males that you're with who are captives. There's obviously something that could happen to you that was not likely to happen to them. But once you're being held, you're being held. And when you die, you die. And death is agnostic. So again, I don't think there's a film. Well, I know there's not a film who captures all of this in one story and puts it together so cohesively. The name of the documentary is Love+War. It's a new documentary from our good friends at Nat Geo. We've been speaking with the director, Chai Vasarhelyi, and the subject, Lynsey Addario. The film is going to be in theaters, if I'm not screwing this up, coming October 29th. I really suggest that people, I always say vote with your dollars, so please go out and vote with your dollars. But then it is going to be streaming, I'm assuming on the Nat Geo tile on Disney Plus, and everybody, it's okay to go back to watching Disney Plus for the moment. We'll keep you updated. But for the moment, they're still our friends. November 7th, it's going to be streaming. I highly, highly recommend this documentary. Thank you to you both for taking time to talk about it with us this morning. Lynsey, thank you for your work. And Chai, as always, just as a documentary filmmaker, and now as well a narrative filmmaker, thank you for your work. We deeply appreciate it. Thanks for being on Doc Talk.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
John, thank you so much for your interview with Lynsey Addario and with Chai Vasarhelyi about Love+War, which I think is an outstanding film. I got to see it in Toronto and interview them there. And we see what incredible risk, of course, Lynsey has put her life into for the sake of all of us, so we understand what the stakes and what so many people around the world are going through in a conflict setting. And one of those journalists who understood that from personal experience was the late Brent Renaud, who was killed very early in the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine. He was killed in March 2022. There's a new film coming out directed by his brother, Craig Renaud. That's Armed Only with a Camera. Very, very poignant, powerful film. It's produced by Juan Arredondo, who was with Brent in that very attack that claimed Brent's life. Juan was severely injured in it as well. Very powerful film. John, here now is our interview with Craig Renaud and Juan Arredondo about Armed Only with a Camera. We are joined now by Craig Renaud, who's the director of Armed Only with a Camera, and with Juan Arredondo, who is the producer of the film. Both of you are in the film. This is, Craig, a tribute to your brother, Brent Renaud, the renowned photojournalist and journalist who was killed very early in the war in Ukraine, the first American journalist killed in that conflict. And maybe you could tell us, as the film is set to debut on HBO, about wanting to show what a compassionate person Brent was, and that was the foremost value, I think, that he brought into the field, into such dangerous territory as Ukraine, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Haiti, other parts of the world. It was very, very dangerous work.
Thank you for having us. I'm really appreciative of any time that we can talk about Brent. Today's his birthday. He would have been 54 years old today, October 2nd.
Wow.
And got a text from my mom this morning, saying it never gets easier. So it's a joyful day for us to have this film out, but she's right, it never gets easier. And we just wanted to do our best to show people who Brent was. I mean, this is who he was. He was a quiet, modest, compassionate person, and that's what he led with. I think he probably would not like a film being focused on him. If he was around, he would prefer the camera to be the other way. But and so it was really just trying to look back. We're verite documentary filmmakers, so it was very difficult to even get Brent in the film a lot. And so a lot of the process of this film was going back through 25 plus years of archives and digging for Brent's voice as much as possible, and just finding those moments where you could see, enough of him to know what he looked like, to know what he sounded like, and then just try to find these moments where you see how the subjects interacted with him and the people that met him along the way. And I think when you meet Brent, you know instantly that you can trust him. He never had any agendas. He only cared about reaching people and telling their stories, and he was very pure in that.
There's a beautiful moment in the film that's shot in Somalia. And Craig, I think you may have been with your brother there, because we see in the film you're partners in filmmaking. You're 2 years younger than Brent, your older brother. You were very, very close. You traveled the world, reported from many of these places together. But in Somalia, we see Brent with his camera interviewing a Somali man who's been pretty severely injured in a car bombing. And something about the man's immediate response to Brent is so moving. And he says to Brent, "You're doing it from your heart. We can change the world." And I think that's such a powerful moment and says so much, again, about your brother.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that scene out. I mean, that is my favorite moment in the film, because it does speak volumes about that way he interacted and how quickly, somebody watching him from across the room could see that in him, and how genuine he did care. And it is, in the times that we are living in right now, to see that exchange of compassion, even with somebody so severely injured, was just such a strong moment of humanity for me to see that. And when I came across that footage, it's the kind of thing that typically you would have missed in the edit room if you weren't searching for Brent's voice. It was almost a passing moment. And so I'm just so grateful that we stumbled upon that and that didn't get lost in the archives somewhere, because it is so important moment in the film.
Juan, you were with at Brent's side in this attack in Irpin, Ukraine in March of 2022. This is very close to Kiev. And it's described in the film and has been reported as an ambush by by Russian soldiers who clearly were targeting and have throughout the war targeted civilians, but also journalists. You were severely injured in that attack as well. What can you tell us about the circumstances and what happened?
Sure. Again, thank you. I express the same as Craig. Thank you for having us here today, John and Matt, and remembering Brent. So quickly, we were there. We had been working on a project that was looking at refugees across the globe. We had visited Central America, Greece, planning to go in other countries, and then the invasion of Russia into Ukraine started February 24th. And so we were there by March 8th or 9th, almost a week after the invasion. There was already a number, about 2 million people fleeing the country. And so we wanted to tell that story. Our goal was never to go to the front lines. That was happening in the Far East. But we wanted to go and see where was the genesis of this displacement, where were the genesis of people being taken from and evacuated to the west. And we found ourselves in Kiev. Kiev was, as the capital, it was a city that became a transit city. On the outskirts of Kiev, there is Irpin and Bucha. That's where a lot of the people were being evacuated from. So we arrived, that was a Sunday, March 13th. We arrived there in the morning, and Ukrainians strategically had bombed some of the access points to Kiev, so we couldn't go with our driver and fixer at the time. So we started walking, and there's this famous bridge that I think most of us remember that people were sheltering under, or people were crossing, being helped by soldiers. So we crossed that bridge, and we can see some civilian cars evacuating with flags, with tags saying civilians. Some of it you can see that had bullet holes. But we kept pushing to see if we can get any footage of those families, those people, civilians being evacuated. Probably 40 minutes into by walking, a couple of cars stopped by. We don't know Ukrainian, they didn't know English, but the last driver did. And he asked us what we were trying to do. He said, we're trying to get to Irpin. So he says, let me take you. I'm a volunteer. I'm evacuating people. And so we did. And shortly after that is when I do remember I was sitting in the back of the car. Brent was in the front with a passenger seat and the driver. And I saw from the corner of my eye, a soldier pull out an AK-47. So I yelled, "We're getting shot." I ducked, and all I remember was feeling the car making this U-turn, and then just the barrage of bullets hitting the car. It happened very fast, but in our minds, that's just hours. And by that time that the car stopped because it broke down because of the impact, I was shot in the back and my leg, and when I got up, I saw Brent bleeding from the neck.
Wow.
And then so quickly we tried to evacuate him, put him by the side of the road. I was already bleeding profusely, fainting, and the logic there was that there was a relay every 15 minutes of cars coming and taking civilians out. And so I was evacuated, and then shortly after that, I called Craig, gave him the news, and I was evacuated taken to a hospital.
It's remarkable to see where you all go to tell stories that the rest of us in some ways take for granted, how we get these images, how we get these stories, right? It's harrowing. We see it. Well, someone was just there with a camera, but we see you all in, whether it's Honduras, Somalia, Haiti, going and tell these stories. That's one thing. But what I appreciated so much about this film was, Craig, the measure of people who came and spoke at his memorial and the vastness of them, so that you feel like, there's, I think, a sense from some people, yeah, journalists, you just stick a camera in someone's face, you get the picture you want, and that's all there is to it. But when you see, on the one hand, they're not in uniforms at the service, but military men who serve and sing his praises as someone who was not just there to get a story, but to be a comrade and to take risks. When you hear the same story from a Black dude from Chicago who's talking about, unfortunately, they live in an at-risk community as well. I would love for you both to talk about what it was about Brent that you feel like made him not just someone who was an objective observer, but could be objective, but also, allow his emotions to connect with the subject so that they trusted when the camera was rolling, you and Craig, yourself, Juan, and Brent were telling their story and not just getting pictures to sell newspapers or get clicks.
Yeah, it was overwhelming, and just when we arrived, like when I landed in Arkansas, and like organically, these are soldiers that we were embedded in Iraq with, had gathered and gave Brent this military convoy from the airport to the funeral home. I mean, it spoke volumes. I mean, these are people that, that was 20 years prior that we were embedded in Iraq. And that was the kind of impact he had on people. Yeah, it was something. I mean, we had a fixer, and I don't even really like using that word because he's a friend. But Miguel Macias, who we've worked in Juarez with for 20 plus years. I mean, we watched kids grow up. We worked with him in dangerous places. And, he drove 17 hours overnight to be at the funeral. It's just powerful. Powerful. Yeah.
I remember we had this motto that is we don't follow a schedule, follow a story. And that can mean going back as many times and visiting and revisiting until we finally get the story right. And I think Brent had this, having had that honor to work with him, I could see how attentive he was to people, how respectful he was to the people he was interviewing, but also the attention that the detail to plan every shoot. He would research very well. He would engage with them, and sometimes long conversations even before we arrived. So by the time we got to sit down and film, it was almost like friends were just reuniting, right? It wasn't just a parachute journalism where you just show up, you sit somebody and you talk and you leave. This is months in planning. And I think that's sort of what Renaud brothers films are, I think, have an essential quality to it, is that they're very long form and they keep up with the subjects, right? They keep in touch with the subjects and they keep coming revisiting. So the fact that Derek came and spoke at the eulogy, you guys, Craig, how long have you been filming it, Derek?
Yeah, I mean, during COVID, Brent and I were editing a story about Derek that we were putting together, and it was over 15 years of footage since the time we met Derek. And we would go back and just keep going back and checking on the people in Derek's community. So yeah, I mean, it's impossible to film with a family for 15 years and not develop these very, very close relationships. Derek was just at a screening that we had in Arkansas with his two boys, and I watched them grow up. I mean, the first time I met these young men, they were really small children following Derek around, and they showed up to this screening as grown men, and that's how long we've known them. But yeah, I mean, the funeral in itself was just such a tribute to him, and I cannot imagine this story about Brent without the gift of those eulogies, because they spoke in a way that that nobody else could have spoke about Brent. And it was profound and poetic, and just so grateful for those relationships and that they would come and honor him in that way.
Obviously, you all go, as you say, where the story dictates, and film and show things that are, I can't imagine what they're like to witness in the moment. but are necessary for the rest of us just to know what's going on in the world, and that problems are not just minimal. Sometimes they're maximal. When you see what's going on in Haiti or Honduras or places like that, you make a choice in the film, however, to show your brother's body. And there's a moment where you say, Craig, this is what he would want. And I get it in the moment of, you can't shy away, you can't look away. And if you're going to report something, even if it's your brother's passing, but if you could just expand on that in terms of, when you say this is what your brother would wanted, you're not being glib, but talk about how necessary that is sometimes to show things where some of us would go, why would you show that? But if you're going to tell the story, you've got to tell all of the story.
Brent and I have had these conversations over our 20 plus years of doing this work. During harrowing times, we would talk about the what ifs, when we were in these places together, what if somebody's kidnapped? What if somebody's killed? What do you do? And we all, we keep telling the story. And I think we can't we have reported on these horrific wars all over the world. We have captured people's misery and grief and the violence. And I just couldn't imagine not doing the same thing when it came to my brother. And I felt very confident that that's exactly what he would tell me to do, is to keep filming. And I had a conversation with my mom and my sister on the way to Ukraine, talking about that moment, because, I knew I was heading over to get him, and we talked about it as a family. And I wanted to make sure that they were okay with that, but we all agreed that it was necessary, that you can't shy away from this. You can't sanitize the horrific things that happen to people in war. We had a discussion the other night with Amy Goodman, and she brought up Emmett Till's family. And that's something I actually mentioned to my mother. I just said, I know this is difficult to think about, but I think we have to think about the bigger impact of, his story and what this tribute to him can be, which is bigger than just Brent. It's a tribute to all fallen journalists who do this work and have a target on their back and put themselves at risk. So it was not easy to do it, but it was not a hard decision, that it was the right thing to do.
Juan, as we've been discussing, you were right there in Ukraine. I think there's a question that underpins the film for viewers, is that why would anyone do this? Why would anyone put themselves at such peril? You've explained the circumstances and the story that you were working on about refugees, about people forced from their homes. But I think it'll help us understand Brent's motivation if you wouldn't mind speaking to why you personally are willing to put your life on the line. You easily could have been killed that day, or I'm sure under many other circumstances that you've been filming.
Right. Thank you, Matt, for that question. I think for me, I grew up in Colombia, in a country that also had a good share of violence. And there were many moments where I saw violence or people in power rewrite history. So I think for first and foremost, we are witnesses to history. That's what journalists, and at least I feel that that's what I'm doing, is going to record history. So we don't forget. So no one can come and say that didn't happen, or no one can come and rewrite history. I think that's one of my first goals as a journalist. Second is because we want to empower those people on the margins of society. And in a situation of war, it is very important to give people's perspective and their voices. And so if I can mediate that, if I can facilitate that, I'm willing to take that risk. I think early on, I never came to this profession thinking I wanted to be a conflict or a war correspondent. I think, on the contrary, I just want to tell stories. But I think I also try to use this analogy sometimes with people. It's like, do you ask a firefighter why they run towards the fire? That's just the calling. I feel that's our calling, right? There are ways of not being reckless and doing it in safe ways. It's all about risk management, and there's always this percentage that something can go wrong. And for us, it did go wrong. unfortunately, Brent lost his life. But that's the calling that I think we have, is to be there, to give voices and to witness history and present it to the world, right? And then people can make their decisions whether there is actually a war happening in Ukraine. There are people being displaced, and the atrocities that are being committed unfairly and unjust to a population.
Thank you, Juan, for explaining your perspective and motivation there. Craig, you mentioned, and it's certainly very understandable, that when you're trying to make a film about a photojournalist or a journalist, I mean, generally they're not on camera. That's the whole idea, especially the way that your brother and you approach storytelling. It's not about yourselves. It's about whoever you were interviewing, whoever you were encountering in these circumstances. But you were able to find some moments, and one of them I think is so revealing and poignant, is that Brent talks about being on the autism spectrum. And there's a really remarkable moment where he says, in a firefight, I can be perfectly calm. When I'm at a cocktail party in New York, that's when I feel uncomfortable. And that's such poignant and revealing comment that he made.
Yeah. Yeah, that was Brent. I mean, he wow, yeah, I mean, and I don't think I ever would have been comfortable revealing that if he had not revealed it publicly, and actually the way that Juan and Brent met, they were both Harvard Nieman fellows, and they have to do a sounding where everybody, prepares the sounding to talk about their life and career. And Brent had prepared 2 endings for that sounding, and he wasn't sure if he was going to reveal this very personal thing. And it was something that Brent got self-diagnosed as an adult a few years before he died. He's a very private, quiet person. He never talked about it. But fortunately, he felt comfortable during this fellowship to share that, and Juan recorded it. He was there for that. And thankfully, he opened that up, because I do think it's very important part of the film to know that about him. And then I think you start to understand that tenderness, that quiet, his intensity, his work ethic, everything about who he was. And so yeah, I was glad that was there. I was glad that my parents had a Super 8 film camera, and my mom handed me, like all these reels that were in perfect condition of our childhood to go along with that. And so that was another gift to this story.
The name of the film is Armed Only with a Camera. It's going to begin streaming on October 21st on HBO Max. We have been speaking with the director of the film, Craig Renaud, and the producer of the film, Juan Arredondo. I really want to thank you both, not just for the film, which is powerful, not just for what you do and going out and telling these stories of conflict and distress, but also for honoring the other journalists who, Craig, like your brother, put the story and the truth and the need to show us all what's going on in the world above their own lives. Journalism, ironically and sadly, is becoming one of the most dangerous professions in the world at this time, whether that's abroad or, sadly, in our own country. Gentlemen, thank you to you both. As difficult as it was to tell this story, it was necessary, and you managed to tell it in a very beautiful and honorific way. So thank you. And we appreciate you bringing the story. That's the Doc Talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, John, that was a very powerful interview. We're really grateful to Craig Renaud and Juan Arredondo for spending time with us. As Craig said, it's his brother's birthday, a very, very emotional moment for both of them, and we're grateful to them for their time, and most importantly, for the film.
Yeah. Both of these films, you sort of hit it at the beginning of the conversation, Matt, about you being a journalist, and obviously your situation is very different, but to see what these folks go through, and more importantly, to see the connections they make with their subjects is really, really powerful, and knowing that they care, and they care about telling stories in an honorific fashion.
Yeah, and you pointed out the larger context of this, in which not only are so many journalists losing their lives in Gaza and Ukraine, in many other areas of the world, but journalism itself has been under attack, certainly in the United States, going back 10 years ago now with the sort of arrival of Donald Trump on the scene politically and making or casting journalists as the enemy of the people. That's a refrain that's been heard around the world. But we did want to point out, and as we have a little bit of time here before we close for this episode, to mention that a really important documentary about another great journalist has just been acquired by Netflix. This is Cover Up, which is directed by the Oscar winner Laura Poitras and Mark Obenhaus. It's a really fascinating film, premiered at the Venice Film Festival, about the investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, who many people will recall broke the My Lai massacre story during the Vietnam War. He's probably the single greatest investigative journalist of our time. That's a riveting film, and really, again, belongs in the context of this larger discussion of why journalism is critical in a democratic context, and there isn't democracy without journalism.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, Matt, if there's a trend of more documentaries or high-level documentaries that focus on journalism. I feel like there's a playbook around the world right now, irrespective of nation, irrespective of conflict, where journalists, I don't want to say they got a pass in the past. It was always highly dangerous work to be in a conflict zone, but there was at least some tacit understanding of that's the last thing you want to do is kill a journalist. That's the Rubicon you do not want to cross. And now I feel like you see in all spaces where journalists are targeted, dictators, strong people, bad actor states, whatever it is, know that if you get people to stop recording, if you can scare them away from any level of objectivity, if there's no baseline for journalism, then you can confuse people, and that's when you really start winning wars, whether they're physical wars, shooting wars, psychological warfare. So, hard episode this week, but I really, really appreciate being able to do an episode like this. And like I said, it'll be interesting to see if more documentarians who themselves understand how hard it is to go out and capture these stories really start turning the lens on some of their peers, even if they're slightly different disciplines, but showing what it takes to tell these stories and tell the truth. So, good episode, tough episode.
Yeah, it was very powerful. And again, we're just very thankful to the filmmakers for being with us and sharing that.
Yeah, we will be back again next week, as oftentimes. I'm not sure what we're doing, but we haven't had a problem coming up with something. And I know, Matt, you still have some amazing interviews from Camden, and we may get a taste of those.
Yes,
so
hope so.
We'll have something for you. So please.
We will.
Join us, myself, John Ridley, and my good partner, Matt Carey, again next week on Doc Talk. We'll see you then.